From above, it looked like a coded message, rows of small, red-roofed structures, perfectly aligned in the middle of nowhere. From below, it looked like hope. At first, no one paid much attention. Just another set of dusty houses going up in rural West Africa, probably funded by some donor no one asked for. But then the satellite images went viral. Reports started circling. Unidentified compounds. Foreign involvement suspected. Possible military installations. But on the ground, what was actually happening was this. A woman with cracked hands placed the final brick on her front wall. A child picked up a key that wasn't borrowed. A family opened a door that didn't exist a month earlier. No contractors, no banks, no one in a suit shaking hands for the cameras. They didn't even call it a project. They called it finally. These weren't settlements. They weren't installations. They were homes, quietly, stubbornly, humanly built by people who were tired of asking for permission. This is the story of a housing revolution that nobody invited, but one that refused to wait. Not led by governments, not funded by the IMF, but by people with no land, no rights, no leverage, and no interest in staying invisible any longer. And maybe that's why it scares people. Amina has never signed a lease, never seen her name on a water bill, never had a key that led to a door that was truly hers. She's 74. For decades, she moved between temporary shelters, tin shacks, and unclaimed plots. In her words, not homeless, just never at home. In Burkina Faso's urban zones, this story isn't rare. According to the Ministry of Urban Development, 63% of all residents in informal settlements live without formal land titles or any legal documentation of tenancy. No ID tied to a residence, no right to utilities, no legal recourse if they're evicted. That's not just poverty, that's statistical non-existence. Children born in these conditions often grow up undocumented, missing from national registries, education systems, and health records. Musa is 10. He's never slept in a room with a ceiling. His family covers their bed with a plastic sheet when it rains. On windy nights, he lies awake counting how many gusts it will take to tear the tarp loose. When the government tries to map these communities, they appear as gray zones. No infrastructure, no taxation, no services, just blank space. And yet people live there, work there, raise families, bury their dead. The legal system doesn't know what to do with them. In some areas, eviction orders still reference colonial-era zoning laws from the 1950s, laws that have never been repealed but are still enforced. One researcher from Ouagadougou University put it this way: "The land remembers what the law forgets. Entire neighborhoods exist on memory alone." Compare this to cities like New York or Paris, where tenancy rights are deeply embedded in law, even if you're renting. In Burkina Faso, many families have spent 20, 30, even 40 years occupying land with no form of recognition, no deed, no number, not even a name for their street. And still, people build, piece by piece, cardboard walls, scrap metal roofs, brick ovens, made from leftover clay. Because even a roof made of tin feels better than waiting for permission that never comes. So ask yourself, if the system never gave you a home, and the land beneath you could be taken any day, would you still believe in law? Or would you believe in your hands? There was no anthem, no flag raising, no stage. But something irreversible began the day Burkina Faso turned down $600 million from the International Monetary Fund. It wasn't just about rejecting a loan, it was about rejecting the terms that came with it: privatize land, cut subsidies, open urban housing to international developers. On paper, it was development financing. In practice, it meant handing control of the country's last untapped resource, land, back to the market. The government said no. For the first time in decades, a sitting African president publicly walked away from conditional IMF funds. And instead, something else was signed: the Land Justice Act, 2023. Under this law, over 400 hectares of underutilized and idle land, mostly around peri-urban zones, were reclassified as community development zones. Here's what that meant in real terms. Individuals who could prove residency or local affiliation could claim a 150-300 SQN plot. Ownership came through labor, not capital. You build, you stay. Land that remained untouched for over 18 months reverted to the community. No speculation, no flipping, no buy-to-rent schemes. It was, in the words of a local urban planner, the first housing model in our history that didn't begin with money but with hands. Within 9 months, over 12,000 people had begun construction across 5 regions. No bulldozers, no tenders, just shovels, buckets, and sweat. The bricks were sun-dried, the foundations were collective. Each family that helped another build was one step closer to securing their own home. But this wasn't chaos. Local councils developed community building schedules. Youth groups were trained in basic construction methods. Water points, sanitation units, and waste trenches were designed collectively using open-source blueprints from prior rural housing projects. Each brick was stamped, not by a company, but by the person who molded it. Symbolic? Yes, but also bureaucratically powerful. These stamps became a way to verify time-based ownership under the law. And then came the backlash. Critics called it populism. Opposition politicians labeled it pre-modern land socialism. Foreign think tanks warned of anti-market signals. Some even questioned the legality of redistributing state-held land without auction or bid. But here's the counterpoint. Over 78% of that land had been sitting idle for over 15 years, held by absentee landlords or companies who never developed it. Ask yourself, what's the real threat? People using land, or people hoarding it? In economic terms, the cost of building each unit averaged $2,200 to $2,500 USD, a fraction of traditional housing programs backed by donors, which ranged from $18,000 to $26,000 USD per unit and required years of approvals. And this model didn't produce debt, it produced homes. So no, there was no anthem. But there was something louder, the sound of people digging together at sunrise, in silence, without needing anyone's permission. That's what a revolution looks like when you strip away ideology. Just hands, bricks, and a plot of land that finally said, "Welcome home." No construction firm submitted a bid. No foreign architect designed the blueprint. The people built it. With calloused hands, borrowed tools, and no safety nets. In the first phase of the land redistribution, over 200 families began building simultaneously across 5 designated community development zones. Each household was allowed to claim one plot if they committed to begin construction within 30 days. There was no fee, but there was labor, your own. That wasn't a symbolic rule, it was the foundation. Community building clusters were formed, rotating labor pools where 10 families worked on one home at a time, moving to the next when one was done. The majority of workers weren't men in helmets. They were women, teenagers, elders, widows. In one zone outside Kudugu, 72% of the homes were built with major contributions from all female crews. These weren't formal masons. These were farmers, teachers, market vendors, people used to doing things the hard way. When asked why they were building without pay, one woman said, "Because when we were waiting for help, nothing happened. Now we build, and the house appears." That quote isn't poetry. It's a policy. Under the People's Labor Clause, written into the Land Justice Act, labor counted as capital. Every day you contributed, the on-site translated into proof of effort, recorded by a local committee. Once a structure reached 60% completion, it triggered the issuance of a provisional occupancy certificate, a document previously out of reach for most informal settlers. By month 10, over 6,700 such certificates had been issued. And yes, Most of them went to people who had previously never appeared in any land registry. Let's be blunt. This was a wealth transfer. Not through taxes, through tools. What made it work wasn't funding. It was frictionless trust. No bureaucracy, no contractor markup, no layers of middlemen extracting value. Still, not everyone understood it. A West African housing economist was quoted saying, "If labor is currency, where is the incentive? Who verifies output? This is utopian." But the verification came in the most undeniable form. Finished homes. People built with what they had: sun-dried bricks, bamboo reinforcement, recovered sheet metal, earth-based flooring. They weren't pretty, but they were solid. Durability tests from the National Civil Engineering Lab showed that 85% of these structures met regional safety thresholds for permanent occupancy. And here's what doesn't show up in economic spreadsheets. People take care of what they've earned through sweat. Across 3 pilot zones, theft rates dropped. Domestic disputes decreased. Local police noted a 42% reduction in eviction-related incidents compared to the year prior. Because when people build their walls, they protect them. When they paint their own door, they keep it open or shut for a reason. This wasn't just construction. It was a restoration of trust, of purpose, of the ground under your feet that finally says, "This is yours. No one's coming to take it away." So the next time someone asks who built this movement, the answer isn't technical. It's not about supply chains or architects or materials. It's about hands, thousands of them, stacking bricks, bending rebar, and rewriting what it means to own something when no one ever meant for you to own anything at all. At first, they ignored it. Then they misread it. Then they tried to explain it with the only language they trusted: suspicion. When satellite imagery of Burkina Faso's new housing zones began circulating in defense newsletters and development blogs, headlines followed fast. Unregistered settlements raise security questions in Sahel. Could community housing mask paramilitary activity? Burkina turns away from global development norms. None of those reporters visited the sites. None of them interviewed the people holding trowels instead of guns. But from 10,000 kilometers away, they already had a conclusion. What they saw as suspicious uniformity were just neatly aligned homes. What they assumed were command posts were shared kitchens. What they labeled coordinated expansion was labor rotation. It wasn't just bad journalism, it was an ideology. Because in the development world, self-reliance is always suspect. If a community solves a structural problem without donor money, how can you measure success in spreadsheets? If people organize without an NGO's training, how do you audit impact? The assumption was simple and global. Poor people don't build systems. They survive inside them. So when communities in Burkina Faso built not just homes, but roads, drainage, schools, and cooperatives, without formal permission, the narrative flipped from neglect to fear. Reports from 2 European consultancies raised flags. The Burkina model risks signaling policy deviance across West African urban centers. Community land management may undermine long-term investment confidence. Translation: if this works, others might copy it. Let's be blunt. Much of modern development work is not built on outcomes. It's built on control, of metrics, of funding, of narrative, and this was off-script. One UN-affiliated analyst warned, "We must ensure that alternative models do not erode trust in formal processes." But which formal processes? The ones that require 5-year feasibility studies, 30% consultant fees, and 3-year delays before a brick is even touched? Meanwhile, in Burkina Faso, homes were going up in 10 weeks. Data from the Ministry of Housing shows that over 10 to 800 units were built within 14 months of the Land Justice Act's rollout. That's nearly double the pace of donor-funded projects over the same period, at less than 12% the cost per unit. But that statistic never made it into the press. Instead, what circulated was doubt. Are these settlements legal? Are they safe? Are they scalable? Rarely. Are they working? The deeper truth, media narratives aren't just shaped by what's visible. They're shaped by who benefits from visibility. When suffering is televised, it invites aid. When dignity is quiet, it's ignored. Or worse, attacked. This is not unique to Burkina Faso. In Kenya, community land cooperatives have been accused of being informal insurgency zones. In Haiti, post-earthquake rebuilding efforts led by citizen brigades were dismissed as unregulated chaos. In India, slum redevelopment projects run by residents themselves were shut down for violating urban codes. The pattern is global. When the poor wait, they're seen as helpless. When they act, they're seen as dangerous. Because it's not the poverty that threatens the system, it's the independence. So here's the real question. When media narratives label community action as instability, who are they really protecting? And when people build without asking, what are they really destroying? Not borders, not in order, just the illusion that progress needs permission. She's 8 years old. Her name is Rukiatu, and she wears her house key around her neck like a medal. It's a cheap, scratched-up brass key, but it opens something rare where she lives. A locked front door, a boundary, a pause button on chaos. For the first time, her family isn't sleeping under a tarp or inside a rental they could be evicted from without warning. They have walls, a floor, a lock, and that key, it's not just metal, it belongs. Rukiatu's family was one of the 6,200 households relocated through the Labor for Land Clause under Burkina Faso's Land Justice Act. Before that, they lived in Sector 17, a high-density informal zone in Ouagadougou, where over 76% of residents had no legal claim to the land they lived on. She missed school often, not because of fees, but because she didn't sleep. Rain would soak the mattress. Heat made the air inside toxic. And there were no walls, just fabric and fear. In the new house, she sleeps. Every night. On a mat with a roof above and no rats crawling under. Her school attendance improved. Her grades stabilized. And she started drawing. Not just trees and animals, but rooms, doors, beds, tables. When asked why, she said, "Now I know what a house looks like from the inside." That's not sentiment. That's the structure. A study by the Burkina Institute for Urban Social Research found that children living in newly secured housing zones were 43% more likely to attend school regularly than those in informal settlements. Among girls, the number jumped to 51%. The reason isn't abstract. It's about predictability. When a child knows where they'll sleep, they begin to plan for tomorrow. Safety becomes a baseline, not a privilege. Teachers in the 3 primary schools nearest the community build zones, report lower dropout rates, and improved hygiene. One principal said, "We didn't teach them cleanliness, their homes did." And then there's mental health. A 2024 UNICEF-sponsored study showed that children in insecure housing environments were twice as likely to show symptoms of chronic anxiety, attention deficit, and interrupted cognitive development. It's not a small thing when a child gets a door. It's the difference between preparing for school or for flood, between planning your day or scanning the sky. And yet this part rarely makes it into policy briefs. Because it's hard to graph how a child's handwriting changes after getting sleep, or how their drawings shift from shadows to symmetry. So they skip it, and keep asking, is this model scalable? Is it efficient? Is it legal? But no one asks Rukiatu, and if they did, she'd point to her key. Because for her, the debate ended the day that lock clicked shut behind her, and no one else had the power to open it. By month 14, the numbers were undeniable. Over 24,000 people had moved into housing they helped build. More than 9,000 homes completed across 6 regions. Average cost per unit, $2,350 USD, fully inclusive of materials, sanitation, basic water points, and structural labor. No bank loans, no donor grants, no private developers. But not everyone saw this as success. A leaked internal report from a regional development agency warned that the widespread normalization of non-financial land acquisition may destabilize long-term real estate markets and create irregular urbanization. Translation: poor people getting homes without paying rent breaks the model. International consultancies began pulling out of adjacent infrastructure deals. One European funder suspended a $28 million sanitation project, citing uncertainty in land tenure structure. Another paused negotiations on solar grid expansion, arguing the zones lacked sufficient governance channels. But none of the homes were built in secret. Each was registered under the Community Verification Committee, with daily records of labor, plot dimensions, and GPS-based mapping. The government even published an open ledger of construction timelines and household assignments, updated monthly. Still, external investors called it opaque. So let's be honest. This wasn't about legality. It was about losing leverage. For decades, the housing crisis has been a business model, one that thrives on debt, scarcity, and dependency. A $600 million housing fund, managed across 10 years, means consultants, subcontractors, urban planners, M&E officers, training workshops, pilot phases, press releases. But $2,350 per home with zero bureaucracy? That's not scalable for them. Because when dignity becomes cheap, the market loses value. And here's the paradox. When the poor are desperate, they're seen as passive recipients. When they organize, they're seen as threats. But the threat isn't violence, it's precedent. In 2024, two other West African nations began studying the Burkina model. In Senegal, a parliamentary working group quietly drafted a similar land-labor exchange bill. In Benin, a coalition of civil society orgs began identifying underused peri-urban land parcels for collective development. That's the real cost of dignity. Contagion. One international housing executive said, off record, "If this gets legitimized, we'll have to rewrite every risk model we use in sub-Saharan planning. Because how do you price out land when people stop believing they need your permission to build? And how do you maintain scarcity when the ground beneath your model stops being scarce? Let's ask it plainly. Is dignity expensive, or is it just unprofitable?" Because the people building homes in Burkina Faso aren't bankrupting the system, they're exposing it. And for those invested in control, that may be the most dangerous construction of all. There were no national colors, no drums, no televised parade, no minister standing at a podium. Just people walking. In silence. Down roads they carved themselves with shovels, rakes, and the backs of their own hands. Some carried brooms, symbols not of cleanliness, but of arrival. Sweeping the dust not of poverty, but of permission. One woman pinned her old eviction notice to the front wall of her new home. Another painted her daughter's name in charcoal on the inside of the door, before the paint even dried. That was her anthem. In the year since the Land Justice Act passed, over 9,200 structures had been built and occupied. Aerial photos showed satellite towns rising in concentric rings, organic, decentralized, self-regulating. To outsiders, it looked chaotic. To those inside, it was the first time the city had bent around them, not the other way around. Local economies adapted. New vendors emerged. Informal co-ops were registered. School registration in Zone 4B jumped by 38%, leading to the hiring of 22 new teachers. Birth registrations increased as more women gave birth in their own homes instead of transit shelters. But none of this was reported. Because it didn't fit the old narrative, Africa needs help, poor people need instruction, urbanization needs control. There was no speech declaring independence, because no one gave them freedom. They took it, not by protest, not by force, by staying, by building, by refusing to move when the map said they didn't exist. A local mayor said, "They didn't ask for power, they acted as if they already had it." That's what real independence sounds like. Not fireworks, but bricks tapping into mortar before dawn. Not flags waving, but quiet footsteps walking home at night without fear. The legacy of this movement won't be a law. Laws can be repealed. It will be the shift in expectation. That a woman can claim land through labor. That a child can hold a key without debt. That a community can organize without supervision and still create order. That development doesn't have to look like paperwork. So no, there was no anthem. But there were tens of thousands of people who woke up this morning on ground they no longer had to borrow. And when they stepped outside, there was no applause, just the quiet sound of ownership. That's what revolution sounds like when no one is watching. And it doesn't need to be loud, because it's already permanent. What if home ownership wasn't about credit, but about contribution? What if dignity wasn't delivered through aid, but built through action? And if the people with the least were the first to organize themselves, what does that say about the rest of us? You've just watched a story that many governments wouldn't want told, and many institutions still don't understand. So here's the real question. If you had to choose between permission and permanence, which one would you build? Leave a comment, add your voice. And if this challenged your view of what development can look like, share it, pass it on. Because revolutions don't always begin with protests. Sometimes they begin with a brick.